Grammar Lesson 4.2, Stem Changing Verbs. Before we get started with today's lesson, you'll want to make sure you have either a highlighter or a red pen handy. If you don't have a red pen, then just grab some color that contrasts the color that you're writing with. So maybe orange or pink or purple or whatever you have. We're going to start off with a couple of stem changing verbs that you might recognize. We've briefly covered the verbs tener for to have and jugar for to play in class. Now these verbs are both part of this new category of verbs called stem changing verbs. You'll notice in stem changing verbs what we do basically is take the stem of the verb, which is not the AR, ER, or IR ending, but the other part of the verb, and we're going to change a vowel in this part of the verb. Let's look at some more examples. There are three types of stem changing verbs: E to IE verbs, O to UE verbs, and E to I verbs. This simply means in an E to IE verb where you see the E, we're going to change that to an IE when we conjugate the verb. O will change to a UE in conjugations. And for the other type of verb, the E will change to an I when the verb is conjugated. Now you might be thinking, wait a minute, what about the verb jugar? In that one we changed the U to a UE. You would be correct in that, but it just so happens that jugar is the only verb that we do that with. So it's kind of in a class all on its own, and that's why I taught you that verb separately. Let's look at some examples of E to IE verbs. As you know, there are three different kinds of verbs: AR, ER, and IR verbs. Something about stem changing verbs that's important for you to remember is that they're still going to have the same endings as any other AR, ER, or IR verb. Here are a couple of examples. The verb cerrar is an AR verb, and you can see that each of the 6 forms has that typical AR ending. The ER verb querer has all of the traditional or typical ER verb endings, and the IR verb preferir has all of the same endings as any other IR verb. The main thing we're going to be looking at as we conjugate these verbs is the stem of the verb, hence stem changing verbs. Okay, look at the different forms of the verb cerrar. We have yo cierro, tú cierras, él, ella, or usted cierra, nosotros cerramos, vosotros cerráis, ellos, ellas, or ustedes cierran. As you copy this conjugation chart into your notes, make sure you color code this stem and the change that we made. We went from an E in the infinitive verb cerrar to an IE in 4 of the 6 forms. Next, let's look at the verb querer, which is an ER verb. Again, you'll notice in these conjugations, 4 of the 6 change from an E to an IE. In the final verb, preferir, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to change an E to an IE. Now, preferir is a little bit different because when you look at the stem of the verb, you can see that there are 2 E's in the stem of this verb. And you're going to come across a couple of others like this when you get your verb list. The thing that you need to remember about these types of verbs is that the stem change occurs in the E that is closest to the end of the verb. So in this particular verb, it's not the first E, but the second E that we will stem change, as in these examples. As you're looking at these examples and filling in your chart, you might have noticed that we didn't do any kind of stem changing in the nosotros or vosotros forms of the verbs. You would be correct in this observation. And this pattern will be consistent throughout all of the stem changing verbs that you learn and that you use. Sometimes I like to refer to stem changing verbs as boot verbs, and that's because if you were to draw a boot around the verbs that do stem change, or add a picture of a boot, as I've done here, you would find that the nosotros and vosotros forms are left out. Let's look at some examples of O to UE verbs. Here's an AR verb, an ER verb, and an IR verb. Again, you can see that The endings look just like any other typical or regular pattern AR, ER, or IR verb. So our focus on today's lesson is not how the verb ends, but how the stem of the verb changes. In the infinitive verbs contar, volver, and dormir, you can see that there's an O in each of those infinitive verbs. Once the verbs are conjugated, however, that O was changed to a UE. Just like the E to IE verbs, we did not stem change in the nosotros and vosotros forms. So again, if you were to put those verbs inside of a boot, you would leave out the nosotros and vosotros forms. There are not too many E to I verbs. This is going to be your smallest list, so I only have one example for you. Servir, which is an IR verb. You'll notice in this one, the E in servir changes to an I in the 4 of the 6 forms. And lastly, if you're not into remembering these as the boot verbs, because for some reason you're not into boots, you can just call them the shoe verbs or the high top verbs or whatever it is that you want to call them. So I simply use boot because that helps me remember that I don't stem change in nosotros and vosotros. But whatever terminology is going to help you remember that you only stem change in those 4 of the 6 forms, just go ahead and use whatever term is most useful for you.